Thanks for joining us on KARE 11 News Now. I'm Rena Sargentopoulos. Let's get right to your headlines. Happening right now, voters in Roseville and Shoreview are heading to the polls for a special election that will decide the balance of power in the Minnesota House. Republican Paul Wickstrom and DFL candidate David Gottfried are on the ballot. It's important to note that the balance of power in the House will not change overnight. If DFL candidate David Gottfried wins, party leaders tell KARE 11 the earliest he would be seated is March 17th. So Republicans will hold a majority for the rest of the week. The power sharing agreement that the two parties agreed to would begin once he is seated. If Republican candidate Paul Wickstrom wins, the GOP would reach the 68 members needed to pass legislation off the floor. Right now, the GOP has 67 members to the DFL's 66. Polls, by the way, are open until 8 p.m. Right now in Washington, House Republicans confident they can push through a short-term funding bill this afternoon, avoiding a government shutdown, which is set for this Friday. This measure is a 6-month Band-Aid for larger budget problems. It would keep the government funded and open until September. Democratic leaders in the House are very against the bill, saying they had no part in shaping it, and because of that, they will not vote for it. It can pass in the House with all but one Republican vote, assuming that every Democrat votes against it. Now, if it passes the House, it will then head to the Senate, where it will need 60 votes to pass. Also happening today on the other side of the world, the U.S. is part of a summit with Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia, trying to work out a deal to help Ukraine end its years-long war with Russia. It comes as parts of Moscow are picking up after a drone strike there that authorities say is Ukraine's largest attack on the Russian capital. The attack killed at least one person, damaged several multi-story buildings, and suspended air and train travel for several hours this morning. Keir Simmons is in Saudi Arabia with the latest on those peace talks.
Well, the U.S. and Ukrainian delegations are locked in a neighboring room from here, stopping for lunch but continuing their conversation. Secretary Rubio with a thumbs up as he entered the talks. The Ukrainians describing the atmosphere as constructive. The Secretary of State indicating on the flight here to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia that their main goal is to understand the position of the Ukrainians and of the Russians, but suggesting again that the U.S. is looking for Ukraine to agree to give up some of its sovereign territory. President Zelensky, who was here overnight meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, talking about some of the things he is looking for, including the handing over of prisoners, including children, but also saying that he had a conversation with the Saudi Crown Prince about security guarantees for Ukraine. That, of course, the vexed issue that inflamed that meeting in the Oval Office with President Trump. The damage from that is one of the issues the Ukrainians are trying to repair in this meeting. Meanwhile, the Russians once again indicating that they are not in a hurry for a ceasefire or certainly a deal. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov addressing Russians, saying that some people are rushing to put on rose-colored glasses about the new relationship between Russia and the United States, but saying, though, that Russia will, he says, defend its interests. Keir Simmons, NBC News, Jeddah.
Meanwhile, President Trump doubling down on tariffs today. He says he would increase planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum by an additional 25%, raising it to 50%. That move comes in retaliation to Ontario Premier Doug Ford announcing a 25% tariff yesterday on electricity that it provides to some U.S. states, including Minnesota. That electricity tariff is in retaliation to the first announced tariffs on Canadian goods by President Trump. Premier Doug Ford commented on today's announcement from President Trump during an interview on MSNBC.
It's going to hurt your manufacturing. You need the aluminum. You need our high-grade nickel. And I want to send more high-grade nickel. You need our electricity. You need the 4.3 million barrels of oil that gets shipped down. I want to make sure we build an AMCAN fortress, the two greatest countries in the world. Fighting like this does not make sense. But I will respond appropriately on the electricity. Stay tuned.
Well, this comes as economists are warning of a potential recession as U.S. stocks plunged on Monday, losing a combined $4 trillion in value during that sell-off. An economics professor from the University of St. Thomas says it's hard to predict if we're approaching a recession, and mixed signals like more jobs but less consumer spending are adding to the uncertainty.
I think it's too soon to be worried. It is one of those times where my ears perk up, start trying to figure out the overall picture and say, what are the data points that are pointing to strength and what are the data points that maybe are pointing towards weakness. Concerned, they can kind of close their wallets, and that can show up in all kinds of things in the economy.
Despite consumers' uncertainty and stock market chaos, Shipper says the probability of heading into a recession this year is still relatively low. Goldman Sachs puts the odds at 20%, a number Shipper agrees with. It's also important to remember that even though the two are closely related, the stock market is not the economy. Well, today marks 5 years since the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. The virus disrupted daily life, strained healthcare systems, and reshaped scientific research. Hospitals developed more efficient ways to coordinate resources, particularly during COVID-19 surges. But despite those efforts, COVID-19 did take a devastating toll. According to a CDC estimate, close to 150 million cases of the virus have been reported in America since the start of the pandemic, with roughly 1.2 million people dying from the disease. Uncertainty is swirling in St. Paul tonight after the only grocery store in downtown announced that it is closing. Ken Erdahl spoke to residents and businesses around the store who have serious questions about the future.
St. Paul Lunds & Byerly's customers are still shocked at the thought of downtown becoming a food desert in a couple weeks.
I am really sad about it. My sister and I walk here pretty often, and it's kind of like the only grocery store that we can walk to. The closest place is like half an hour on the bus.
Still, Nevaeh Sanders McCoy is well aware of the reality. The company cites significant staffing and financial challenges since COVID, with declining foot traffic leading to increased crime. And a devastating arson in 2022 came with increased costs to rehab and secure the store.
There's a few of the people that work there that I see pretty often, and they have talked about how it's kind of been harder.
We love Lunds. I'm sad to see them go, but I understand why they need to leave.
Carol Hun Gregory, owner of Keys Cafe across from Lunds, says before the pandemic, the grocery store would be packed with office workers during lunch, and so was her dining room.
I probably had 4 waitresses on, sometimes 5.
These days, she says, look around. 1 or 2 waitstaff are plenty, and with a massive construction project about to tear up Robert Street until at least November, she's bracing for another blow.
It's going to be a tough summer. I just have my kids working, and we'll go down to whatever we have to get through this.
She simply hopes they won't be doing it across from an empty store. In its statement, Lunds & Byerly's wrote, "We are partnering with the city and our landlord to keep our store equipment and infrastructure in place with the goal of maintaining an optimal environment for a future grocery store."
I appreciate Lunds keeping that infrastructure there so that maybe a Trader Joe's or a Mississippi Market or an Aldi's can go in.
Hopeful that something like that happens soon.
Because if it doesn't, many will feel alone in the desert.
Like, I don't want to be just left in the dust and not have another option to turn to.
It's worth noting that this is happening as downtown St. Paul is converting 2 office buildings into housing, and other development is planned. That is not lost on the St. Paul Downtown Alliance. President of the Alliance, Joe Spencer, said in a statement, downtown St. Paul is at a pivotal moment in its redevelopment, and the Downtown Alliance is continuously working alongside our public and private partners to intensify efforts to revitalize downtown, and that a grocery store is essential to that goal. Happening right now, a fear of flying is pushing airline sales down after multiple passenger jet crashes in recent weeks. Delta CEO says 2 crashes are likely at least part of the reason why people are pulling back from traveling so far this year. Now, one of those crashes involved a Delta plane from Minneapolis, which flipped upside down as it landed in Toronto last month. Incredibly, everyone survived. Meanwhile, American Airlines CEO says his airline's deadly crash over the Potomac River in D.C. played a huge factor in their reduced revenue forecast for the year. However, he says his airline's focus, is taking care of the families of the victims that were lost in that crash. And if you are traveling anytime soon, you should listen up. Southwest Airlines is ending one of its biggest perks, free checked bags. The airline just announced it will start charging flyers for their first and second checked bags. That starts March 28th. However, members of Southwest's A-List loyalty program or those traveling in business class are exempt from those fees. It comes just months after Southwest ditched another one of its policies that separated it from other airlines, that open seating policy. Looks like inside an EF2 tornado as it moves across the ground in Lake Mary, Florida. You can see all the debris flying, hitting this woman's car. Forecasters say winds gusted up to 120 miles per hour, as the storm struck in that area. So far, thankfully, there have not been any reports of serious injuries. Stick with us. More news and weather coming up after the break.